Dr. Carter Reid had seen death before, but he'd never seen it last exactly 3 minutes. The heart monitor's flatline tone cut through the ICU like a knife. His hands moved automatically. Compressions, one after another, each one a refusal to let her go. Elena Reeves, 28 years old. No reason she should be dying on his table. Then the monitor stuttered. A beep. Another. Her eyes opened. Not the slow flutter of someone waking from sleep. Instant. Focused. And fixed directly on him with a certainty that made his skin crawl. Carter stepped back, chest heaving from exertion, watching her with clinical assessment, pupils reactive, breathing spontaneous. "The scar," she whispered, her voice raw. "On your left shoulder. Your father gave it to you." The air left his lungs. "You still dream about it. Every single night." He'd never told anyone that. Not his ex-wife, not his therapist, no one. "Should I keep going, doctor?" Her eyes never left his. "Or do you want to know what else I saw? While I was dead." Carter's foot caught the edge of a medical cart as he stepped back. The metallic clang echoed through the room, but he barely registered it. His mind was still caught on her words, on the impossible specificity of what she'd said about his shoulder, about his father, about dreams he'd never spoken aloud to anyone. He forced air into his lungs, found his voice somewhere beneath the shock. "I need a full neuroassessment. Now." His voice came out steadier than he felt. The ICU team materialized around him like they always did, efficient and practiced. Nurse practitioner Michelle Chen appeared at his elbow with a tablet, her fingers already moving across the screen. Carter watched his own hand reach for the stylus, watched it tremble slightly as he began documenting orders. Cognitive function battery. Complete metabolic panel. Another EEG. Oxygen saturation every 15 minutes. The words were rote, muscle memory from 1,000 other codes, but they felt hollow now, insufficient. What test could explain what had just happened? What scan could reveal how a patient who'd been clinically dead knew things locked inside his head? "Dr. Reid, are you ordering a psych consult?" Michelle's question cut through his spiraling thoughts. He looked up. The whole team was watching him now, waiting. Elena was watching too, propped up on pillows, those dark eyes tracking his every movement with unsettling clarity. Yes, psych consult, and keep her on continuous monitoring. He turned back to the tablet, but the screen blurred. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. He gripped the stylus harder, pressed it against the glass, and dragged it through the electronic forms with mechanical precision. Labs, imaging, protocols, everything by the book, everything documented, everything controlled. "Dr. Reid?" It was Sarah Kim, one of the newer residents, standing close enough that he could smell her vanilla coffee. She was looking at him with concern that made his chest tight. "Are you all right?" The question was simple. Expected. He'd asked it of colleagues 100 times after difficult cases. "Fine. Just been a long shift." The lie tasted chemical on his tongue, sterile and wrong. Sarah didn't look convinced, but she nodded and turned back to Elena's monitors. The team moved around him and practiced choreography, checking vitals, adjusting IV lines, noting responses. Elena submitted to it all quietly, but her gaze kept drifting back to him. Carter finished the orders with hands that felt disconnected from his body, signed off, handed the tablet back to Michelle. "Page me with any changes." He was already moving toward the door before anyone could respond. The hallway hit him like cold water. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The smell of antiseptic and floor wax. The distant beeping of monitors from other rooms. Everything normal. Everything exactly as it should be. He pressed his back against the wall beside Elena's door, just out of sight of the nurse's station. His heart was hammering against his ribs. He could feel sweat cooling at his hairline, his collar suddenly too tight. Carter closed his eyes and tried to catalog what had happened with clinical detachment. Patient experienced cardiac arrest. Successfully resuscitated after 3 minutes of systole. Patient emerged from clinical death with intact neurological function and demonstrated knowledge of physician's personal history that she could not reasonably possess. The explanation sounded insane even in his own head. He pressed the heels of his palms against his eyes until colors bloomed behind his eyelids. When he opened them again, the hallway was still there, still real, still impossible to explain. The cursor blinked at him from the white expanse of the incident report form. On, off, on, off. A tiny accusing metronome counting the seconds he sat there unable to type the truth. Carter's office was small, windowless, tucked into a corner of the administrative wing where visiting physicians were given temporary space. He'd worked here for 3 years and still hadn't hung anything on the walls. The overhead light hummed. Beyond his door, the hospital moved through its nightly rhythms. Code pages, medication carts rattling down hallways, the hushed, urgent voices of night shift doing what night shift always did. In here, silence wrapped around him like something physical. His fingers found the keyboard, started typing. Patient Elena Reeves, female, 28 years old, presented with sudden cardiac arrest at 22:47. Resuscitation efforts initiated immediately. Patient achieved return of spontaneous circulation after 3 minutes of advanced cardiac life support. Upon regaining consciousness, patient demonstrated. He stopped, read it back, deleted the last sentence. Upon regaining consciousness, patient exhibited knowledge of attending physician's personal history, including details about childhood trauma that could not have been obtained through normal means. Delete. Upon regaining consciousness, patient spoke about events from attending physician's past that she had no access to. Delete. Upon regaining consciousness, patient said things she shouldn't know. Carter pushed back from the desk. The chair wheels squeaked against linoleum. He stood, paced to the door, pressed his ear against it. Nothing. No one listening. He was alone with this impossible thing and the blinking cursor waiting for him to explain it. He sat back down, tried again. The words he needed didn't exist in medical terminology. There was no diagnostic code for psychic phenomenon, no protocol for patients who wake from death knowing your secrets. The forms demanded facts, observations, clinical language. They had no space for impossible. His phone buzzed. A text from Michelle. Patient stable, all vitals normal. Psych consult scheduled for 6 in the morning. Carter stared at the message. Stable. Normal. Words that meant nothing now. He returned to the screen, forced himself to type something that would satisfy the institutional requirement without revealing what had actually happened. Patient responsive post-resuscitation. Neurologically intact. Glasgow Coma Scale, 15. Oriented to person, place, and time. Cognitive function appears preserved. Psychiatric evaluation recommended due to unusual statements made upon regaining consciousness. Patient claims knowledge of personal details about medical staff. Recommend full psychiatric workup to rule out confabulation, delirium, or other post-anoxic psychological phenomena. His finger hovered over the save button. It was a lie. Not technically. Everything he'd written was factual, but it buried the truth under clinical language, made Elena sound confused rather than impossibly aware. It protected him. protected the hospital, made something inexplicable sound like a routine psychiatric concern. He saved the file, the screen confirmed, report submitted, time stamped, entered into Elena's permanent medical record. Carter immediately wanted to delete it, wanted to write what had actually happened. That she'd looked at him with eyes that had been dead 3 minutes before, and spoken truths he'd hidden from everyone, including himself. That death had somehow opened a door between their minds. That nothing about this was explainable or containable or safe to document. But the report was already in the system, already permanent. He closed the laptop, sat in the humming silence of his office, and felt the weight of the lie settle into his bones, like something he'd never be able to wash away. The hallway was empty at 3 a.m. Carter's shoes made soft sounds against the linoleum as he approached Elena's room. Through the small window in the door, he could see her sitting upright in bed, backlit by the dim glow of monitors. Awake, alert, watching the door like she'd been waiting for him. He pushed through, clipboard held against his chest like armor. The room smelled of antiseptic and the faint metallic tang that always lingered after a code. Elena turned her head as he entered, and even in the low light, her eyes were sharp. Too sharp. Patients who'd been dead 3 minutes didn't look like this. They were confused, disoriented, struggling to piece together what had happened. She looked like she'd been awake for hours, thinking. "Miss Reeves, I need to ask you some questions." His voice came out clinical, detached, exactly what he needed. "Of course. Can you tell me where you are?" "A hospital. Your hospital specifically. St. Catherine's Medical Center." "What year is it?" 2025. "Who's the president?" She answered correctly. He moved through the standard cognitive assessment, checking boxes on his clipboard, documenting responses that were all perfectly normal. Oriented to person, place, and time. No signs of confusion or cognitive impairment. Everything textbook. Then she smiled. It wasn't warm, wasn't reassuring. It was sad in a way that made his throat tight. "You want to know how I know about your father?" Carter's pen stopped moving across the page. He didn't look up from the clipboard. "You think I read your file somehow? Or overheard something? Maybe you talked about it in the hallway once and I was walking by. You're trying to find a rational explanation." He forced himself to meet her eyes. They held something that looked like pity. "I didn't read anything, Dr. Reid. I didn't overhear anything." Elena shifted in the bed, and the monitors beeped softly with her movement. She folded her hands in her lap like she was about to explain something simple to a child who couldn't quite grasp it. "I was inside your head. For 3 minutes, I was everywhere you've ever been." The words landed between them like stones dropped in still water. "That's not possible, I know. But it happened anyway." Carter's fingers tightened on the clipboard. Medical school had taught him to approach impossible symptoms with differential diagnosis. Rule out the likely before considering the unlikely. But there was no diagnosis for this. No pathology that explained a patient accessing memories locked inside someone else's mind. "You experienced hypoxia, brain trauma from the cardiac arrest. It's common for patients to have vivid hallucinations, to confabulate details. Is that what you're going to tell yourself?" Her voice was gentle but unwavering. She wasn't angry, wasn't defensive, just tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. "I saw your 7th birthday. Your father was sober that day. He took you to the aquarium, and you stood in front of the shark tank for an hour because you'd never seen anything so beautiful and terrifying at the same time. He bought you a stuffed shark in the gift shop. You slept with it every night until he burned it during one of his rages 2 years later. Carter's breath caught in his chest. No one knew about that shark. He'd never told anyone. Not his ex-wife. Not his therapist. It was a small, stupid childhood memory he'd buried so deep he barely remembered it himself. How? The word came out broken. Elena's sad smile deepened. I don't know, doctor. I was dead. And then I was you. All of you, every memory, every fear, every moment you've tried to forget. She paused. And now I can't unknow it. Carter should leave. Should walk out of this room and page psychiatry and let someone else handle whatever this was. Should document her claims as delusional and maintain professional distance. Should do anything except stand here asking her to prove the impossible. But his mouth moved anyway. Prove it. The words came out harsh, challenging. A defense against the fear climbing up his spine. Elena's expression shifted. The sadness in her eyes deepened into something that looked like grief. Not for herself, for him. Your mother's voice. She said it quietly, carefully, like she was handling something fragile. You can't remember it anymore. Carter's hand tightened on the clipboard until his knuckles went white. You've tried. Late at night when you can't sleep, you play the old voicemails she left on your father's answering machine. The ones you saved before he threw the machine away. You transferred them to your phone years ago. 3 messages. One where she's reminding him about a parent-teacher conference. One where she's asking him to pick up milk. One where she's laughing at something your sister said in the background. The room tilted slightly. Carter locked his knees to keep standing. But they don't sound like her. Not like you remember. The recordings are tinny and compressed, and they've degraded over time. Sometimes you listen to them on repeat, trying to hear what you've lost, trying to remember exactly how she said your name, the exact pitch of her laugh. But it's gone, faded, like water through your fingers. His breath caught somewhere in his chest and wouldn't release. She died when he was 12. A car accident on a Tuesday afternoon. He'd been at soccer practice. His father picked him up 3 hours late, drunk, and told him in the parking lot. For years afterward, Carter had been able to hear her voice perfectly, could close his eyes and summon the exact sound of her calling him down for breakfast, reading him stories before bed, singing off-key while she cooked dinner. But somewhere in his 20s, it had started to fade. First the singing, then the story-reading voice, then everything except a vague approximation that he knew wasn't quite right. He'd kept the voicemails like archaeological artifacts, proof she'd existed, but they didn't bring her back. They just reminded him what he'd lost. He'd never told anyone. Not his ex-wife during their marriage. Not his therapist during their sessions after the divorce. It was too small and too devastating. The kind of grief that didn't have words. How? It came out as a whisper. Broken. All his clinical detachment stripped away. Elena looked at him with eyes that held too much understanding. Too much of him. I don't know. Her voice was exhausted. Honest. I was dead, Dr. Reid. And then I wasn't. And in between, I was you. I felt what you felt. Remembered what you remembered. I know what it's like to be 12 years old and realize you're forgetting the most important voice you've ever known. I know how you blame yourself for that. How it feels like losing her all over again. Carter's hand found the edge of the bed rail. Gripped it. I know what it felt like to be you. All of you. The good parts you hide, and the broken parts you think define you. I didn't choose this. I don't want to know these things, but I do." She paused, swallowed hard. "And I'm so sorry." The apology broke something in him. Carter stood in the dim room, holding onto the bed rail like it was the only solid thing left in the world, and felt every defense he'd built crumble into dust. Dawn came slowly to the hospital. Gray light filtered through the windows at the end of the corridor, turning everything pale and washed out. Carter stood at the nurse's station, a chart open in front of him that he hadn't actually read in 20 minutes. His eyes kept drifting to Elena's room 3 doors down. She was sleeping now. Finally. He'd stayed with her for another hour after she'd told him about his mother's voice, neither of them speaking, the weight of what she knew settling between them like something physical. When her eyes had finally closed, he'd left, walked the halls, returned to his office, stared at walls, and somehow ended up back here as the night shift bled into morning. He hadn't slept. Couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Elena's face as she spoke truths no one should know. Carter. He looked up. Dr. Sarah Park stood beside him, 2 cups of coffee in her hands. She offered him one. He took it automatically, the warmth seeping into his palms. "You look like hell." Sarah had worked at St. Catherine's for 5 years, 2 years longer than Carter. She was good at her job, better at reading people. Her dark eyes scanned his face with the same precision she used for patient assessments. "Rough code last night." He said it like it explained everything. Took a sip of coffee that tasted like cardboard and exhaustion. "The Reeves case?" He nodded. Sarah leaned against the counter beside him, her own coffee cradled between both hands. She was quiet for a moment, and Carter hoped she'd let it drop. "Move on to something else. Anything else. It's unusual." Her voice was thoughtful, clinical. 28 years old, perfect health according to her records. No cardiac history, no drug use, no underlying conditions. Then sudden cardiac arrest. 3 minutes down, and now she's sitting up in bed like nothing happened. Neurologically intact, cognitively perfect. It doesn't make sense. Carter kept his eyes on the chart in front of him. Someone's medication schedule. He couldn't focus on the words. The other doctors are calling it a medical mystery. Johnson wants to write it up for a journal. Martinez thinks we missed something in her initial workup. Sarah paused. "What do you think?" He thought that journals and workups were the least of his concerns, that the real mystery wasn't medical, that Elena Reeves had died and come back knowing things she couldn't possibly know, and no amount of testing would explain it. "I think we need to run more tests." The lie tasted familiar now, easier each time. Sarah was quiet. Carter could feel her watching him, that analytical gaze he'd seen her turn on patients who weren't telling her the whole truth. He forced himself to look at her, to meet her eyes, to project the tired competence of a doctor after a difficult night. "You sure you're okay?" "Fine. Just need sleep." She didn't look convinced. Her fingers drummed against her coffee cup, a nervous habit she had when she was thinking. Carter waited for her to push, to ask more questions, to see through the facade he was barely holding together. Instead, she nodded slowly. "Get some rest. I'll keep an eye on her." Sarah pushed off from the counter and walked away, her footsteps soft against the linoleum. But she glanced back once before turning the corner, and Carter saw the concern in her expression, the doubt. He looked back at Elena's room, at the closed door hiding impossible secrets, and realized with sudden cold certainty that he couldn't hide this alone. That Sarah's questions were just the beginning, that the hospital would want answers he couldn't give, that every hour Elena stayed here made the truth harder to contain. The coffee had gone cold in his hands. Dawn light spread across the hallway floor, and Carter understood that everything was about to get much worse. Elena lay still in the hospital bed, watching the morning light creep across the ceiling tiles. She'd closed her eyes when Dr. Reid left, pretending to sleep because she could feel his exhaustion and knew he needed an excuse to go. But sleep wouldn't come. Her mind was too crowded now. Her own memories were there. 28 years of her life, intact and familiar. Her apartment with the north-facing windows, the coffee shop on Bartlett Street where she worked on illustrations, the careful, quiet existence she'd built for herself after everything that came before. But now there were other things, memories that weren't hers. A kitchen with yellow wallpaper peeling at the corners, the weight of a hand on a small shoulder, gripped too tight, fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. The sharp smell of whiskey, and underneath it, fear. A child's fear that never quite left, just transformed into something else. Something that looked like control. Carter's kitchen, Carter's father, Carter's fear. She knew these things now like she'd lived them herself. Could close her eyes and be 7 years old in that kitchen. Could feel the linoleum cold under bare feet. Could hear the specific timbre of a drunk man's voice promising consequences. The memories sat in her head, with the same weight and texture as her own, uninvited and impossible to ignore. Elena pressed her palm against her chest, where they'd placed the defibrillator paddles. The skin was tender. She could feel her heartbeat underneath, steady and reliable like it hadn't stopped, like she hadn't been dead. 3 minutes. That's what she'd heard them say. 3 minutes without a pulse, without breath, without the electrical signals that made a brain work. She remembered dying. Not the pain before it, that had been sudden and overwhelming, but the moment after, the letting go, the sense of dissolving into something vast and dark and finally peaceful. And then the pulling back, violent and unwanted, the slam of electricity forcing her heart to remember its rhythm, air burning into lungs that had forgotten how to expand, the crash of consciousness returning like a wave, but not alone, not just her. She'd come back tangled up in him somehow, in Dr. Carter Reid, in his memories and his pain and his carefully maintained distance from everything that might hurt him. Elena didn't ask for this, didn't want to know that he associates the smell of antiseptic with safety because it means he's at the hospital, not home. Didn't want to understand why he keeps everyone at arm's length. Didn't want to carry the weight of his mother's fading voice or his father's heavy hand or the 1,000 small ways he'd learned to survive by not feeling too much. But she knew it all now, vivid and intrusive, like someone else's dream had bled into her waking life and wouldn't drain away. She touched her chest again, felt the steady beat underneath. Had dying broken something in her? Cracked open some barrier that was supposed to stay closed? Or had it fixed something? Some fracture in reality she'd been walking around with her whole life without knowing? Elena had spent 28 years building walls around herself, keeping people out, staying safe by staying separate. And now she was trapped inside someone else's head, knowing him more intimately than she'd ever known anyone. And he was a stranger. A doctor who'd shocked her heart back to life and gotten tangled up in the process. She closed her eyes, saw his childhood kitchen again, yellow wallpaper, cold linoleum, and wondered if either of them would ever be separate again. The email arrived at 8:30 in the morning, terse and professional. Victoria Cross requested his presence in her office at 9. Carter stared at the message on his phone, his stomach tightening. The hospital administrator didn't summon doctors for routine matters. He took the stairs to the fourth-floor administrative wing. The carpet here was newer, the walls painted in soothing blues meant to project competence and calm. Victoria's office sat at the end of the hall, her name engraved on a brass plate beside the door. Her assistant waved him through without a word. Victoria Cross was 52, sharp-featured, with silver hair cut precisely at her shoulders. She'd run St. Catherine's for 6 years with the kind of efficiency that prioritized outcomes over sentiment. She sat behind a glass desk, Elena's preliminary reports spread in front of her. "Dr. Reid, sit." Carter sat. Victoria tapped one manicured nail against the top report. The sound was sharp in the quiet office. Elena Reeves, 28 years old, sudden cardiac arrest. No underlying conditions, no clear etiology. She looked up, her gray eyes flat and assessing. "This raises questions. We're running a full workup. I know. I've seen your orders. But I want to be clear about what's at stake here." Victoria leaned forward slightly, her hands folded on the desk. "A seemingly healthy young woman has a cardiac event in our ICU with no identifiable cause. That's a liability concern. If we missed something in her initial assessment, if there was negligence, if equipment failed, we need to know. We need documentation. Every test, every observation, everything that could possibly be relevant. It's being handled." "Good." Victoria's expression didn't soften. "Because this is the kind of case that gets attention, Dr. Reid. Medical journals want unusual cases. News outlets love medical mysteries. A beautiful young woman who nearly died for no apparent reason makes compelling television." She paused, letting the implication settle. "We need to be careful. Thorough documentation protects the hospital, but we also need to control the narrative. No speculation, no dramatic statements, just facts and proper medical procedure." Carter understood what she wasn't saying directly. "Don't let this become a scandal. Don't let this damage St. Catherine's reputation. Don't create problems. I understand. Do you?" Victoria's gaze sharpened. "Because I've been doing this long enough to know when a doctor gets too invested in a patient. I saw you listed as primary on her case despite the fact that you were off rotation when she coded. I saw you in her room at 3 in the morning when you should have been home sleeping." Carter kept his expression neutral. "She's a complex case. She's a patient. You're a physician. Maintain appropriate boundaries." "Of course." Victoria leaned back, apparently satisfied. "Full workup, complete documentation. And if anything unusual emerges, you come to me first. Not to colleagues, not to journals. To me. Understood?" "Understood." She dismissed him with a nod. Carter stood, turned toward the door, his mind already racing ahead. "Dr. Reid." He stopped, looked back. Victoria's expression was unreadable. "Be careful. For your sake and hers." The door closed behind him with a soft click. Carter stood in the carpeted hallway, his heart beating too fast. Victoria wanted documentation, thorough records, every detail captured and analyzed. She wanted to protect the hospital from liability, from bad press, from anything that might damage St. Catherine's carefully maintained reputation. If anyone discovered what Elena could actually do, documentation would be the least of their concerns. She wouldn't be a patient anymore. She'd become a case study, a phenomenon, a specimen to be examined and tested and written about in journals that would turn her into an object of scientific curiosity rather than a human being. Carter thought about her lying in that hospital bed, exhausted and overwhelmed, carrying memories that weren't hers. knowing things she never asked to know. And he realized with cold, absolute certainty that protecting her meant keeping the truth buried, no matter what it cost him. Carter returned to Elena's room at 7 that evening with a paper bag from the Italian place 2 blocks from the hospital. Real food, not the bland institutional meals that appeared on plastic trays 3 times a day. He told himself it was just practical, that she needed to eat, that it was basic patient care. But they both knew it was more than that. Elena looked surprised when he set the bag on her bedside table. Surprised and something else. Cautious. Hopeful. They ate in silence. Elena picked at the pasta, taking small bites, her appetite clearly diminished. Carter ate mechanically, tasting nothing. The room hummed with monitor sounds and unspoken words. Finally, he set down his fork. Tell me everything. Everything you saw. Elena stopped eating, her hands stilled in her lap. For a long moment, she didn't speak, and Carter thought maybe she'd refuse. Maybe the burden of knowing was too heavy to share back. Then she began. Your 7th birthday. Your father was sober that day. Actually sober, not just pretending. He took you to the aquarium. You stood in front of the shark tank for an hour because you'd never seen anything so beautiful and terrifying at the same time. He was patient with you. Kind. He bought you that stuffed shark in the gift shop, and you slept with it every night until he burned it 2 years later during one of his rages. Carter remembered the shark. Hadn't thought about it in decades. Elena continued, her voice soft but steady. The first surgery you observed in medical school. You were 24. An emergency appendectomy. The attending let you stand close enough to see everything. The precision of the incision. The way the human body opened up like a map of itself. You thought it was the most incredible thing you'd ever witnessed. And then afterward, you locked yourself in the bathroom and cried for 20 minutes because you couldn't stop thinking about how fragile we all are. How close to breaking. He had cried, had leaned against the cold tile wall and felt overwhelmed by the terrifying intimacy of cutting into another human being. The woman you almost married. Rebecca. You met her during your residency. She was smart and funny, and she loved you without asking you to be different than you were. You were going to propose. You bought a ring. Carried it in your pocket for 3 weeks. But you couldn't do it. Because she wanted the version of you that didn't exist. The one who came home at reasonable hours. Who wanted children. Who could be present instead of always half somewhere else. You broke her heart to save her from a life with someone who couldn't give her what she deserved. Each revelation landed like a small violation. Intimate truths he'd never spoken aloud, now reflected back to him from someone who'd been inside his head, inside his life, inside every private moment he'd thought was his alone. Elena described more, small things and large things, forgotten afternoons and pivotal decisions, the texture of his loneliness, the shape of his regrets, the careful architecture of distance he'd built around himself. When she finally stopped, the silence felt different, heavier. Carter sat with it, with all of it, everything she'd seen, everything she knew. I believe you. The words came out quiet but certain. Elena's face transformed, the tension in her shoulders released. Her eyes filled with tears she didn't let fall. I was terrified no one would. Her voice broke slightly. That I'd tell you and you'd think I was crazy. That they'd lock me up somewhere. That I'd be alone with all of this, and no one would understand. Carter looked at her. This woman who carried his memories like unwanted baggage, who knew him more completely than anyone ever had, who hadn't asked for any of it. You're not crazy, and you're not alone. Carter returned to his apartment at midnight, but didn't sleep. He sat at his kitchen table with his laptop, coffee going cold beside him, and searched for answers that made sense. Near-death experiences. He started there, found thousands of articles, patients reporting tunnels of light, feelings of peace, out-of-body sensations. Some claimed to have seen things they couldn't have seen, heard conversations from other rooms, known details about their resuscitation. But the studies were messy, anecdotal. Most scientists attributed the experiences to oxygen deprivation, the brain's desperate firing of neurons as it approached shutdown. Hallucinations given meaning by a mind trying to make sense of trauma. None of it explained Elena. He dug deeper, shared consciousness, telepathy, neurological anomalies during cardiac arrest. The literature was sparse and mostly speculative. A few case studies from the 1970s, poorly documented. One from a hospital in Tokyo about a patient who claimed to know things about her doctor, but the details were vague. The patient had died 3 days later. No follow-up. Carter read until his eyes burned. Downloaded studies, made notes, cross-referenced journals. The screen light turned his small kitchen ghostly blue. At 2 a.m, he picked up his phone. Dr. Raymond Torres had been his mentor during medical school, a neurologist who dedicated his career to studying consciousness. How the brain created the sense of self. What happened to awareness during sleep, anesthesia, coma. He'd published extensively, spoke at conferences, maintained a reputation for taking unusual cases seriously, even when other doctors dismissed them. The phone rang 4 times before Raymond answered, his voice thick with sleep. Carter. Do you know what time it is? I need to ask you something. Hypothetically. Raymond sighed. Carter heard rustling, probably sitting up in bed. This better be good. Carter chose his words carefully. Patient, late 20s, cardiac arrest, 3 minutes of clinical death, successful resuscitation, neurologically intact afterward, but claiming to have accessed memories from the attending physician during the period of brain death. Specific memories, verifiable details the patient couldn't possibly know through normal means. Silence on the other end. Then Raymond's voice, more alert now. Accessed memories. You mean like reading thoughts? Something like that? Information transfer during the death experience. Raymond was quiet for a moment. Carter could hear him thinking. The brain does remarkable things during crisis. We know that periods of hypoxia can create vivid hallucinations. Patients sometimes report elaborate visions, conversations with deceased relatives, detailed scenes that feel completely real. But specific, verifiable information? More silence. That's harder to explain. There are cases of patients reporting things they observed during their code, surgical instruments, conversations between medical staff. We think that might be explained by residual consciousness, moments of awareness during what we thought was complete unconsciousness. What about memories from another person's mind? Carter heard Raymond get out of bed. Footsteps. Then the sound of water running. That's not neurology, Carter. That's science fiction. There's no mechanism for it. No way for one brain to access information stored in another brain. Consciousness is contained. Private. There's no biological pathway for memory transfer between individuals. What if there was? Then we'd have to rewrite everything we know about how consciousness works. Raymond paused. This is hypothetical, right? You don't actually have a patient claiming this? Carter hesitated a beat too long. Raymond's voice sharpened. Carter, If you have a real case, you need to document it properly. Bring in specialists. This could be groundbreaking, or it could be psychiatric. But you can't handle it alone. I know. Another lie. Getting easier each time. He thanked Raymond and ended the call, sat in his dark kitchen with his cold coffee and his laptop full of inadequate answers. The research gave him nothing. No explanation. No precedent. No rational framework for what Elena could do. Which meant either she was experiencing an elaborate delusion that happened to include verifiable details she couldn't know, or something impossible had actually happened. And Carter didn't believe in impossible anymore. Elena brought it up the next afternoon when Carter came to check her vitals. He was adjusting her IV line, trying to maintain some semblance of professional routine, when she spoke. We should test it. He looked up. Her expression was serious, determined. Test what? Whether I actually know these things or if I'm just convincing us both of something impossible. Carter started to object, but she continued. You could be filling in gaps, confirming things I say because you want to believe me, or because the details are vague enough to match multiple memories. We need something specific, something you can verify independently. She was right. Part of him had been hoping that rational explanation would emerge, that Raymond would call back with a neurological syndrome that explained everything, that the research would yield answers. But another part of him knew, had known since she mentioned his mother's voice. Okay. They sat together in the quiet room, monitors beeping their steady rhythm. Carter tried to think of something verifiable, something concrete. Elena closed her eyes. He watched her face shift through expressions, like she was sorting through files in a cabinet. His files, his memories. There's a safety deposit box. Her eyes opened. You haven't been there in years. 15 years, maybe. Longer. You keep meaning to close it, but you never do. It's at First National Bank. Box number 217. Carter's chest tightened. He'd forgotten about that box. Hadn't thought about it in over a decade, maybe longer. What's inside? Your mother's wedding ring. A simple gold band. She never wore anything fancy. There's an inscription inside, but it's worn down. You can barely read it anymore. Elena's voice was soft, careful. There's a letter. She wrote it to you before she died. Except she didn't know she was going to die. It was just a letter for your 13th birthday. She wrote it 6 months early and put it away for safekeeping. Your father gave it to you after the funeral. You read it once and never looked at it again because it hurt too much. Carter couldn't breathe properly. And there's a photograph. You and her together. You're 11 in the picture. She has her arm around you. You're both laughing. You don't remember that day. Don't remember when it was taken or why. But she looks happy in it. Really happy. You kept it because in most of your memories, she looks tired or worried or scared. But in that photograph, she's just happy. His hands were shaking. He gripped the bed rail to steady them. How could you know that? I don't know. I just see it. Like it's my own memory. The next morning, Carter drove to First National Bank. He'd opened the account when he was 25, right after finishing medical school. Had put his mother's things there for safekeeping. Then never went back. The bank manager led him to the vault. Found box 217. Set it on the table in the small private room. Carter opened it alone. The ring was there. Simple gold band, exactly as Elena described. He picked it up, turned it toward the light. The inscription was worn almost smooth. He could barely make out the words his father had once had engraved there. The letter was folded in an envelope with his name written in his mother's handwriting. He didn't open it. Couldn't. and beneath the letter, the photograph. Carter lifted it with trembling fingers. He was 11, skinny and gap-toothed. His mother had her arm around his shoulders, pulling him close. They were both laughing at something outside the frame. Her face was unguarded, young, happy in a way he'd almost forgotten she could be. He didn't remember that day, had no idea when the photo was taken or what had made them laugh. But Elena knew it was there, had described it perfectly. Carter sat in the small room with the contents of box 217 spread before him, physical proof of something impossible. She hadn't guessed, hadn't inferred, hadn't read his file or overheard conversations. She'd been inside his head, had seen his memories with the same clarity he saw his own. And nothing in his medical training had prepared him for what that meant. The headaches started 3 days after the bank visit. Elena mentioned them casually during morning rounds, like they were barely worth noting. Just a dull ache behind her eyes. Carter ordered a CT scan immediately. By evening, she'd had her first nosebleed. Carter was reviewing labs at the nurse's station when Michelle paged him. He found Elena sitting up in bed, tissue pressed to her nose, blood seeping through the white paper. Her face was pale, frightened. How long? A few minutes. It just started. He examined her carefully, checked her blood pressure, her platelet count, looked for signs of coagulopathy or vascular abnormality. Everything came back normal. The nosebleed stopped on its own after 10 minutes, but Carter ordered more tests anyway. The MRI results came back the next morning. He stood in the radiology reading room, staring at the scans on the monitor. Dr. Patel, the neurologist, pointed to areas of increased activity. Here and here, the hippocampus and the medial prefrontal cortex, regions associated with memory consolidation and retrieval. And look at this activity in the temporoparietal junction. That's linked to empathy, to understanding other people's mental states. Is it dangerous? Not immediately. But it's unusual. I've never seen this pattern in a post-cardiac arrest patient. Usually we see decreased activity, if anything. Hypoxic damage. But her brain is lighting up like she's actively processing complex social and emotional information. What does it mean? Patel shrugged. I don't know. Could be a compensatory mechanism. The brain rewiring itself after trauma. Or it could be something else entirely. We should monitor it closely. Carter thanked him and left with the scans. Took them back to his office. Stared at the bright regions on Elena's brain, the neural pathways firing in patterns that didn't match anything in the literature. He was still staring when Sarah knocked on his door. She didn't wait for an invitation, just walked in and closed the door behind her. We need to talk. Carter looked up. Sarah's expression was serious, concerned. About what? About Elena Reeves. About the fact that you've spent more time with her than any other patient on the floor. About the way you look at her file like it contains state secrets. She's a complicated case. She's a patient, Carter. And you're getting too involved. I'm being thorough. You're being obsessive. Sarah sat down across from him, her voice gentler now. I've known you for 3 years. I've seen you with difficult cases before. This is different. You're in her room at odd hours. You're running tests that other doctors question. You brought her dinner from outside the hospital. That's not thorough. That's personal. Carter wanted to deflect, to lie, to maintain the professional distance that had always protected him. But he was so tired of lying. She knows things about me, things she shouldn't know. Sarah's eyebrows rose. What kind of things? Personal things. From my past. Details I've never told anyone. Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing. Patients sometimes say things that feel eerily accurate. It's pattern recognition, cold reading, or they overhear things and don't remember overhearing them. It's not that. Then what is it? Carter met her eyes. I don't know, but it's real. Sarah leaned back in her chair, studying him with that analytical gaze. You know what this sounds like, right? You know how this looks? Like I'm losing objectivity. Like you're compromised. She wasn't wrong. Carter knew he'd crossed lines he'd never crossed before. That his judgment was clouded by something he couldn't name. That the bond he felt with Elena violated every principle of professional boundaries. But Elena was also the only person who'd ever truly seen him. Every hidden corner, every buried memory, every carefully guarded secret. She knew him completely and hadn't turned away. That created a connection he couldn't explain or dismiss, even as he knew he should. I'll be more careful, Carter. I'm saying this as a friend. Whatever is happening here, you need to step back. Let someone else take over her care. Before this becomes a problem you can't fix. She left him alone with the brain scans and the weight of advice he knew he wouldn't take. Because Elena's headaches were getting worse, her nosebleeds more frequent, and whatever was happening in her brain was accelerating. And he was the only one who understood why. Carter brought coffee that evening. Real coffee from the place down the street, not the watered-down version from the hospital cafeteria. Elena accepted it gratefully, wrapping both hands around the cup like she was cold despite the room being perfectly climate-controlled. They'd fallen into a rhythm over the past week. He'd check her vitals, run whatever tests were scheduled, and then stay. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence. The professional boundary had eroded so completely that pretending it still existed felt pointless. Tell me about before. Elena looked up from her coffee. Before what? Before all this? Before the cardiac arrest? What was your life like? She was quiet for a moment, considering whether to answer. Then she did. Quiet. I worked from home mostly. Medical illustrations for textbooks, surgical guides, anatomy references. I'd get assignments by email, work alone in my apartment, submit the files digitally. Sometimes I'd go weeks without having a real conversation with anyone. Sounds lonely. It was safe. The way she said it made Carter understand. Safety and loneliness weren't opposites for some people. They were the same thing. No family? Elena shook her head. My mother died when I was 16. Cancer. My father wasn't in the picture. I have an aunt somewhere in Oregon, but we don't talk. After my mother died, I went into foster care for 2 years until I aged out. Then I was on my own. She took a sip of coffee. I put myself through community college, got a degree in scientific illustration, built a career where I didn't have to depend on anyone or let anyone depend on me. It worked. I was fine. Were you? Elena's smile was sad. I thought I was. I had my routine, my work, my apartment with good light for drawing. I told myself that was enough, that being alone was a choice, not a symptom. Carter understood that too, the careful architecture of solitude, the way you could build an entire life around not needing people and convince yourself it was strength rather than fear. I did the same thing. I know. Of course she did. She'd seen it all. His own carefully maintained distance, his failed relationships, his devotion to work that doubled as an excuse to avoid intimacy. We're kind of pathetic, aren't you think? Elena's laugh was unexpected, genuine. Two people who spent their whole lives staying separate. And then this happens. The universe has a sick sense of humor. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Elena now knew Carter more intimately than anyone ever had. She'd been inside his head, seen every memory, understood every defense mechanism. And it had happened without either of them choosing it. Without consent or warning, just fate or chance or cosmic accident forcing a connection neither of them had wanted. "Are you afraid?" Carter asked it quietly. Elena set down her coffee, looked at him with those dark eyes that held too much of him, terrified of dying again. She shook her head. "Of what I've become. I know things I shouldn't know. About you. And it's not fading, Carter. If anything, it's getting clearer, more detailed. I can close my eyes and be 7 years old in your kitchen. I can feel what you felt. The fear, the shame, the way you learned to make yourself small so you wouldn't be a target." Her voice cracked slightly. "I didn't ask for this. I don't want to carry your trauma along with my own. But I do, and I can't unknow it. Can't unsee it. I'm stuck being a person who knows too much about someone I barely know, at all. But you do know me. That's the problem." Elena's eyes were wet, but she didn't let the tears fall. "Because now I care about you. And I spent 28 years learning how not to care about anyone, how to be fine alone. And you ruined it by dying on my watch and dragging me into your head when I came back." Carter almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Almost. "I ruined it? You brought me back to life. You couldn't just let me stay dead? Would you rather I had?" Elena was quiet for a long time. "No. But this would be easier if I didn't know you. If you were just some doctor. Instead, you're this whole complicated person with all this pain I can't fix. And I'm terrified of what that means." The email arrived on Thursday morning. The hospital ethics committee requested his presence at 2 that afternoon to discuss the Reeves case. Carter read the message 3 times, his stomach sinking with each pass. Word had spread. The conference room on the 4th floor was too bright, fluorescent lights reflecting off the long glass table. 6 committee members sat waiting when Carter entered. Dr. Victoria Cross at the head, Dr. Patel, the neurologist, Dr. Marsh from psychiatry. 2 bioethicists he recognized but didn't know well, and Dr. Helen Sharp, who chaired the committee, a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and a reputation for prioritizing research over sentiment. "Dr. Reid, thank you for joining us." Helen gestured to an empty chair. Carter sat, feeling like he was on trial. "We've been reviewing the Reeves case. Quite remarkable. A 28-year-old with sudden cardiac arrest, no underlying pathology, and these unusual neurological findings." She tapped a tablet in front of her. Elena's scans, her charts, everything documented and reduced to data points. Dr. Patel has shared some intriguing observations. Increased activity in memory and empathy centers. Patterns we've never seen in post-cardiac arrest patients. This could represent a significant breakthrough in understanding how the brain reorganizes after trauma. We're still monitoring her condition. Carter kept his voice level. Of course. But we believe this case warrants more extensive investigation. We'd like to bring in specialists from the neuroscience department, run additional imaging studies, perhaps some experimental protocols to understand what's happening in her brain. Dr. Marsh leaned forward. There's also the psychiatric component. The patient has made unusual claims about accessing information she shouldn't possess. That's worth studying from a consciousness perspective. She's recovering from a traumatic event. She needs rest, not to be turned into a research subject. But this is exactly the kind of case that advances medical knowledge. Victoria's voice was smooth, reasonable. A young woman who should be neurologically impaired but isn't. a brain that's behaving in ways we don't understand. We have an obligation to study this, for future patients, for science. We also have an obligation to respect patient autonomy. Carter felt heat rising in his chest. She's not a puzzle to be solved. She's a person who nearly died and deserves privacy while she recovers. No one is suggesting we violate her rights. Helen's tone was patient, patronizing. We'll obtain proper consent. Explain the research value. Most patients are honored to contribute to medical knowledge. And if she refuses, then we'll respect that. But I suspect she'll understand the importance of what we're asking. One of the bioethicists spoke up, a younger woman whose name Carter couldn't remember. There's also publication potential here. A case study in a major journal. This could put St. Catherine's at the forefront of consciousness research. The breakthrough potential is extraordinary. Carter looked around the table. They were all watching him with expressions ranging from excitement to clinical detachment. Not one of them was thinking about Elena as a human being. She was a fascinating anomaly, a career-making discovery, a data set waiting to be analyzed and published. I object to this. His voice came out harder than intended. She's my patient. She's been through enough. Turning her into a research specimen while she's still recovering is unethical. Your objection is noted. Helen's expression didn't change. But this decision isn't yours alone to make. The committee agrees that the research value outweighs the inconvenience to the patient. We'll proceed with bringing in specialists and developing an appropriate study protocol. She needs to consent. Of course. We'll speak with her tomorrow. The meeting continued, but Carter barely heard it. They discussed timelines and protocols and which journals to target for publication. They debated whether to involve the media, decided against it for now, but left the option open. Carter sat in his chair and felt rage building in his chest. Clean, clarifying rage at a system that reduced people to cases, that prioritized discovery over dignity, that saw Elena's impossible connection to him as nothing more than a research opportunity. When the meeting finally ended, he left without speaking to anyone. He had less than 24 hours to figure out how to protect her. Carter waited until evening when the floor was quiet. He closed the door to Elena's room and sat in the chair beside her bed. She looked up from the book she'd been pretending to read, saw his expression, and set it aside. What happened? The ethics committee met today about your case. Elena's posture stiffened. They want to study you, bring in specialists from neuroscience, run experimental protocols, brain imaging studies, psychiatric evaluations. They're calling it breakthrough research in consciousness studies. He watched the color drain from her face. When? They're discharging you tomorrow, but they want you to return 3 times a week for testing. They'll obtain your consent, of course. Make it sound like you're contributing to important medical knowledge. Elena's hands gripped the blanket. And if I say no, they'll be very persuasive. They'll talk about helping future patients, advancing science. They might even offer compensation. Her breathing had gone shallow. I can't let them turn me into some kind of experiment. Poke around in my brain trying to figure out why I can do this impossible thing. They'll never let it go. Never let me leave. They will eventually. But Carter knew he was lying. If Elena proved to be a genuine case of consciousness transfer, of one mind accessing another, she'd never have peace. There would always be another test, another specialist, another journal wanting to document the impossible. I can't do it. Elena's voice was firm despite the fear in her eyes. I spent my whole life trying to be invisible, trying not to be noticed. And now they want to make me famous. Put me in medical journals. Turn what happened into a case study. I'd rather die than live like that. Carter sat with that, with the choice in front of him. He could follow protocol, convince Elena to cooperate, let the committee do their research. It was the right thing professionally, the ethical thing according to hospital policy. His career would be fine, maybe even benefit from being associated with groundbreaking research. But Elena would be destroyed by it, reduced to a phenomenon, studied and analyzed until there was nothing private left. He looked at her sitting in that hospital bed, this woman who carried his childhood trauma and his failed relationships and his mother's fading voice, who knew every shameful thing he'd ever done and every fear he'd ever hidden, who'd seen him completely and hadn't turned away. Some debts couldn't be paid with professional distance. "I can help you." He said it quietly, carefully. Elena stared at him. "Help me how?" "Help you disappear, before they can start the testing, before it becomes impossible to leave. You'd lose your job. Probably. Your medical license. Maybe. Everything you've worked for." Carter met her eyes. "I know." The room was silent except for the steady beep of monitors. Elena searched his face for doubt, for hesitation, for signs he didn't mean it. "Why would you do that?" "Because you know me. Really know me. Every ugly part. And you're still here. That means something." He leaned forward slightly. "And because turning you into a research subject while I stand by and watch would make me exactly the kind of doctor I never wanted to be." Elena's eyes were wet. "If we do this, there's no going back. You understand that? They'll come after you. After both of us. I know. You'd be throwing away your career for someone you barely know. But I do know you." Carter's voice was steady. "You've been in my head. But I've spent 2 weeks watching you, talking to you, learning who you are beyond the impossible thing that happened. And I know you're terrified. I know you'd rather run than be studied. I know you value privacy more than almost anything because you've had so little of it in your life." He paused. "So yes, I'm throwing away my career, but not for a stranger, for someone who matters." Elena wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. "When?" "Tonight, before the morning shift, before Victoria comes to talk you into cooperating. We have maybe 12 hours. She nodded slowly, then reached out and took his hand. "Okay, let's run." Carter left Elena's room at 9 and went straight to the administrative system. His hands were steady as he logged in, pulled up her file, and began creating discharge paperwork. Patient stable, neurologically intact, cleared for outpatient follow-up. He backdated the approvals, forged the necessary signatures with a few keystrokes, made it look like she'd gone through proper channels. His heart hammered, but his fingers didn't shake. At 10, he texted Sarah. "Family emergency. Need someone to cover my shifts for the next week. Can you help?" Her response came back within minutes. "Of course. Everything okay?" Another lie. "Will be. Thank you." He disabled location tracking on his phone, withdrew cash from 3 different ATMs, went home and threw clothes into a duffel bag without thinking about what he was packing, grabbed his passport from the desk drawer, even though they weren't leaving the country, grabbed everything that felt important and probably wasn't. At midnight, he returned to the hospital through the parking garage, took the service elevator to avoid security cameras in the main lobby. The night shift was minimal. 2 nurses at the station, both absorbed in their charts. Elena was dressed and waiting. She'd changed out of the hospital gown into the clothes she'd been wearing when she coded. jeans, and a gray sweater. Her few belongings fit in a plastic hospital bag. A phone charger, a wallet, a book someone had brought her that she'd never finished. She looked terrified and determined in equal measure. "Ready?" Carter kept his voice low. Elena nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." They moved quickly. Carter had mapped the route in his head. Down the back stairwell that staff used for smoke breaks, through the service corridor past the laundry and maintenance departments, out the loading dock exit that was only locked from the outside. The night air hit them cold and sharp. Carter's car was parked in the employee lot, nose pointed toward the exit like he'd planned it that way. They were almost to the car when Elena stopped. "Why are you doing this?" Her voice was quiet but insistent. Carter turned to face her. The parking lot lights cast harsh shadows. In the distance, the hospital glowed like something alive. Why? He didn't have a good answer. Not one that made sense when he tried to put it into words. Maybe because you know me and stayed anyway. Most people who know me that well leave eventually. But you can't. You're stuck knowing everything and you haven't run. That's not a reason to throw away your career. Maybe I'm tired of choosing duty over humanity, of doing the right thing according to policy while ignoring what's actually right. He paused. Or maybe it's because for the first time in years, I feel like myself around someone. Not the careful version, not the professional version. Just me. And that's worth protecting. Elena's eyes were bright in the dim light. Even if it costs you everything, even then. They stood there for another moment, the weight of what they were doing settling over them like something physical. Then Elena moved forward and wrapped her arms around him. Brief, tight, a gesture that said more than words could. "Thank you." Carter held her for just a second, then pulled back. "We need to go." They got in the car. Carter started the engine, pulled out of the parking space, headed toward the exit. As they passed through the gate, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The hospital receded behind them, all lit windows and clean lines against the dark sky. Neither of them looked back. The city streets were empty at 2 a.m. Carter drove north out of downtown, toward the highway that would take them away from St. Catherine's, away from the ethics committee, away from everything he'd built over the past 15 years. Beside him, Elena stared out the window in silence. Her reflection in the glass looked small and lost. Where are we going? Somewhere they won't find us. At least for a while. And then what? Carter's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "I don't know, but we'll figure it out." It wasn't much of a plan. It wasn't much of anything. But it was honest. And right now, that felt like enough. They drove north for 3 hours in near silence. The city lights faded behind them, replaced by dark highway and darker woods. Elena pressed her forehead against the window, watching trees blur past in the headlights. Carter kept his eyes on the road and tried not to think about what he'd just done. The cabin was 40 minutes past the last gas station, down a dirt road that barely qualified as one. Carter had bought it 6 years ago during his divorce, some half-formed idea about having a place to escape to. He'd been there maybe 3 times, each visit shorter than the last. Eventually, he'd stopped going altogether, but he'd kept paying the property taxes, kept the utilities connected, as if some part of him had known he'd need it someday. They pulled up to the small structure just after 5 a.m. Dawn was starting to break, turning the sky pale gray. The cabin looked smaller than Carter remembered. Weathered wood siding, a covered porch, windows dark and empty. Elena climbed out of the car slowly, like her body had forgotten how to move. She stared at the cabin, then at the woods surrounding it, then back at Carter. "This is yours. Has been for a while. No one knows about it. It's not in my name. I bought it through an LLC for privacy." Smart. Her voice was flat, exhausted. Carter grabbed their bags from the trunk. The cabin key was where he'd left it, under a rock beside the porch. Steps. He unlocked the door, and they stepped inside. The air smelled stale. Dust covered every surface, but the electricity worked when he flipped the switch. The water ran rust-colored for a minute, then cleared. The heat kicked on with a reluctant groan. It wasn't much. One main room with a kitchenette, a small bedroom, a bathroom with a shower that had seen better days, furniture covered in sheets like ghosts. Elena stood in the center of the main room, still holding her plastic hospital bag. She looked lost, untethered. Then something in her face crumpled. "I'm sorry." Her voice broke on the words. "You threw away everything for me. Your career, your reputation, everything you worked for, and I don't even know if I'm worth it." Carter set down the bags, crossed to her. "You are." "How do you know?" "Because I've spent 15 years being a good doctor, following every rule, maintaining every boundary, choosing my career over everything else. And I was miserable." He paused. "My ex-wife used to say I was married to the hospital, not to her. She was right. I chose duty over her every single time. And when she left, I told myself it was the price of being a good physician. That personal happiness was secondary to professional excellence." "Where are you going with this?" Carter met her eyes. "This is the first time since my mother died that I've put another person before my own safety. Before my career, before what's smart or strategic or professionally sound. And it should feel reckless. It should feel like I'm throwing my life away." Elena waited. "But it doesn't. It feels like waking up. Like I've been sleepwalking for 15 years, and this is the first real choice I've made." Elena's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back since they left the hospital. "Thank you for seeing me as worth saving. No one's ever done that before." She wiped at her face with the back of her hand. "I don't know what happens next. I don't know how we fix this or if we even can. But thank you for not letting them turn me into a specimen." Carter wanted to say something reassuring, something about how they'd figure it out, how everything would be okay. But he was too tired for lies. "We should sleep. Everything else can wait." Elena nodded, looked toward the bedroom, then back at him. "There's only one bed. I'll take the couch." "Carter." She said his name softly. "You don't have to. I trust you." It wasn't a proposition, just honesty, a recognition that they'd already crossed so many lines that sharing space didn't matter anymore. They ended up in the bedroom, fully clothed, lying on top of the covers on opposite sides of the bed. The morning light filtered through dusty curtains. Somewhere outside, birds were starting to sing. Carter closed his eyes and felt the exhaustion crash over him like a wave. Beside him, Elena's breathing slowly evened out into sleep. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Carter felt something close to peace. Sarah discovered Elena's empty room at 6:15 in the morning. She'd come in early to check on her before rounds, still worried about Carter's strange behavior. The bed was made. The monitors were silent. Elena Reeves was gone. Sarah checked the chart, saw the discharge papers, dated and signed. Everything appeared in order. Except Carter had told her yesterday that Elena wasn't being discharged, that the ethics committee wanted her for testing. Sarah pulled out her phone, called Carter. It went straight to voicemail. She called again. Same result. A cold feeling settled in her stomach. By 7, Sarah was in Victoria Cross's office. The hospital administrator's face went from irritated to furious as Sarah explained. He took her. He falsified discharge papers and took her. Victoria's voice was ice. We don't know that for certain. Sarah pulled up the system on her tablet. Look at the timestamps. These approvals were all entered between 9 and 10 last night. After the ethics committee meeting. After Carter knew we wanted her for research. She paused. He asked me to cover his shifts. Said he had a family emergency. I thought he was struggling. I didn't realize he was planning to abscond with a patient. The betrayal in her voice was sharp. She'd trusted Carter, considered him a friend, and he'd used that trust to cover his escape. Victoria was already on her phone, calling hospital security, calling the head of the ethics committee. Her voice clipped and professional, but Sarah could hear the rage underneath. Within an hour, the conference room was full. Victoria, Helen Sharp, Dr. Patel, the hospital's legal counsel, security personnel with tablets showing footage from the previous night. They watched Carter and Elena slip through the service corridor at 2:07 in the morning. Watched them exit through the loading dock. Watched Carter's car leave the employee lot 3 minutes later. This is kidnapping. Helen's voice was flat. She was a patient in our care. He removed her without proper authorization. The discharge papers were forged. Victoria's jaw was tight. Which means we have liability exposure. If anything happens to her, if she has a medical emergency, if she deteriorates, we're responsible. And Dr. Reid has put us all at risk. The legal counsel spoke up. We need to contact the medical board immediately, file a complaint, and we should consider involving law enforcement. Is that necessary? Dr. Patel looked uncomfortable. She wasn't being held against her will. The footage shows her walking out voluntarily. She's a vulnerable patient with a complex medical condition. He's her physician. That's a massive power imbalance. And he violated every ethical principle we have. Helen's eyes were hard. Contact the board. File the complaint. I want his license suspended pending investigation. Victoria nodded. I'll make the calls. Across the city, Raymond Torres was eating breakfast when his phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. Dr. Torres, this is Victoria Cross from St. Catherine's Medical Center. I'm calling about Dr. Carter Reid. Raymond set down his coffee. What about him? He's absconded with a patient, falsified records. We're filing a complaint with the medical board and wanted to know if you'd observed any concerning behavior recently. Raymond's mind flashed back to the late-night phone call, the hypothetical case, the patient who claimed to access another person's memories. It hadn't been hypothetical. Dr. Torres? He called me about a week ago, asked about consciousness transfer, memory access during cardiac arrest. I thought it was a theoretical question. What did you tell him? That it wasn't possible, that there was no biological mechanism for it. Raymond paused. He was serious, wasn't he? This patient. She really claimed to know things she shouldn't. That's part of what makes this so concerning. Victoria's voice was measured. We had planned extensive neurological testing. Dr. Reid removed her before we could proceed, which suggests he knew she'd refuse to cooperate and decided to help her evade medical care. Or he was protecting her. The words came out before Raymond could stop them. Excuse me? If this patient really was demonstrating impossible abilities, turning her into a research subject could be traumatic. Maybe Carter made a judgment call that violated his oath and potentially endangered his patient. Victoria's tone left no room for argument. If you hear from him, you need to contact us immediately. This isn't just about hospital policy. This is about patient safety and professional misconduct. Raymond hung up and stared at his phone. Carter had thrown away his career, his reputation, everything. Which meant the case wasn't hypothetical, wasn't psychiatric, wasn't explainable. It was real. And now the entire medical establishment was mobilizing to find them both. Days blurred together at the cabin. Without the structure of hospital schedules and shift work, time moved differently, slower, more organic. They fell into rhythms without planning them. Carter woke first each morning, started coffee while Elena slept late. She'd emerge around 9, hair tangled, still wearing his old t-shirt she'd claimed as sleepwear. They'd eat breakfast together at the small table. Toast, eggs, simple things that tasted better than they should. During the day, they existed in comfortable orbit. Carter chopped wood for the fireplace, even though it wasn't strictly necessary. Elena found old books on the shelves and read curled up in the armchair by the window. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they sat in silence that felt companionable rather than awkward. At night, they cooked together. Elena was better at it than Carter, her hands confident with a knife, her instincts for seasoning more developed than his. He followed her instructions, chopped vegetables, stirred pots, learned that cooking could be meditative rather than just functional. They talked for hours after dinner, about everything and nothing. Elena told him about her work, the satisfaction of translating complex anatomy into clear illustrations. Carter told her about medicine, about the cases that had stayed with him, about the moment he'd decided to become a doctor. And gradually, carefully, Elena began sharing more of what she'd seen. She asked permission now. Is it okay if I tell you about this memory? Can I share what I saw? Carter learned to say yes. Learned to hear his own life through her eyes. She told him about a surgery when he was a resident, a child with a ruptured appendix, how he'd stayed 3 hours past his shift to make sure the girl was stable, how he'd sat with her parents and explained everything in language they could understand, how gentle he'd been. You think you're cold, Elena said one evening. You think you've lost your compassion. But I saw that moment. I felt what you felt. You cared so much it scared you. Carter had forgotten that case, forgotten the girl's name. But Elena remembered because he remembered, somewhere deep in the archive of experiences he'd stopped accessing. You see yourself as damaged, she continued, as someone your father broke and you never fully repaired. But that's not what I saw. I saw someone who survived, who turned pain into purpose, who became a healer because you understood what it felt like to need healing. Her words settled something in him he hadn't known was unsettled. A week into their exile, Carter built a fire in the stone fireplace. The cabin had grown cold as evening fell. They sat together on the worn couch, watching flames dance behind the grate. Elena was quiet beside him, thoughtful. I'm starting to lose it, she said finally. Lose what? The connection. Your memories. They're fading, not gone, but less vivid, like a radio signal getting weaker. Carter didn't know if that was good or bad. Does that scare you? A little. It was overwhelming, knowing everything about you. But it also meant I wasn't alone with it. Now I'm just me again. And you're just you. And we have to figure out if there's anything real between us without the impossible thing that forced us together. She turned to look at him. Is there? Carter met her eyes, dark and uncertain and hopeful. I think so. Elena reached out slowly. gave him time to pull away. Her fingers found his hand resting on his knee. The touch was electric. Simple contact loaded with everything unsaid between them. Carter didn't pull away. He turned his hand over, laced his fingers through hers, felt the warmth of her palm against his. They sat like that for a long time. Fire crackling. Outside, wind moving through pine trees. Inside, something shifting between them. The impossible connection fading into something else. Something chosen rather than forced. Something fragile and real and worth protecting. Elena leaned her head against his shoulder. Carter pressed his cheek against her hair. And for the first time, what existed between them felt less like mystery and more like the beginning of love. The headaches had been getting worse. Elena mentioned them in passing, tried to downplay the frequency. But Carter noticed, saw her wince when she turned her head too quickly, saw her press fingers to her temples when she thought he wasn't looking. On their 10th night at the cabin, she collapsed. Carter was washing dishes when he heard the sound behind him, a soft thud. He turned to find Elena on the floor beside the couch, her body slack, eyes closed. His medical training took over. He checked her pulse. Steady, airway clear, breathing regular. Not a seizure, not cardiac arrest, something else. He carried her to the bed, monitored her vitals with nothing but his watch and his hands. No equipment, no monitors, no backup if something went truly wrong. She woke 20 minutes later. Carter was sitting beside her, his hand on her wrist, counting heartbeats. Elena's eyes opened slowly, focused on his face. What happened? You collapsed. How do you feel? She considered the question. Different. Different how? The headache's gone, but something else is gone too. Elena sat up slowly. Carter helped her, kept his hand on her shoulder in case she wavered. Your memories. I can't see them as clearly anymore. It's like trying to remember a dream after you wake up. I know they were there. I can recall fragments. But the detail is gone. The vividness. She pressed her hand to her forehead. It's fading. The connection. Whatever let me access what was in your head. It's weakening. Carter didn't know what to say. Didn't know if this was good or catastrophic. How do you feel about that? Elena's expression was complicated. Relief and grief tangled together. Lighter. Like I've been carrying something heavy and someone just took half the weight. All those memories that weren't mine. All that pain I was holding for you. It's receding. I can breathe again. She paused. But I'm also devastated. Because knowing you that completely, being inside your head, it meant I wasn't alone. I understood someone fully, and they understood me because you could see that I was carrying your truth. Now I'm just me again. And you're just you. And I don't know if that's enough. Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. What if the only reason you wanted me was because I was impossible? What if now that I'm becoming ordinary, I'm not interesting anymore? Carter took her hand. That's not true. How do you know? Because I've spent 10 days with you here, learning who you are beyond the impossible thing. You're funny when you're not terrified. You're patient when you cook. You read the same paragraph 3 times if you really love the writing. You hum without realizing it. You're kind and careful, and you see people clearly even without supernatural abilities. He squeezed her fingers. The connection brought us together. But it's not why I'm staying. Elena's eyes filled with tears. But what if I was only brave because I knew you completely? What if without that, I'm just scared again? Just someone who runs from everything? Then we'll figure it out together. Without the impossible thing forcing us, They sat in the quiet bedroom. Outside, night sounds filtered through the windows. Inside, something was ending between them. The supernatural tether that had bound them together was dissolving, and neither of them knew if what remained would be strong enough to hold. But Carter reached for her anyway, pulled her close, felt her rest her head against his chest. The connection was fading. The question now was whether they could build something real to replace it. Something chosen, something human, something that might actually last. Carter's phone had been off for 12 days. He'd removed the battery, tucked it in a drawer, tried to pretend the outside world had stopped existing, but Elena found it while looking for matches. Held it up with a questioning look, just checking if it still works. She said it casually, innocently, pressed the power button before Carter could stop her. The phone came to life and immediately started vibrating with messages, dozens of them, voicemails, texts, emails, all flooding in at once. Carter took the phone from her hands, scrolled through with growing dread. Sarah, 17 messages, the first few concerned, the later ones angry, betrayed. Raymond, 5 voicemails, each one more worried than the last. Victoria Cross, formal emails about disciplinary proceedings and the medical board, official notices, his license under review, suspension pending investigation, words like misconduct and patient endangerment and possible criminal charges. The last message was from a number he didn't recognize. A warrant had been issued for Elena's return for psychiatric evaluation. If Carter returned her voluntarily, there might be leniency. If not, kidnapping charges would be filed. He set the phone down like it was burning him. Elena had been reading over his shoulder. "You have to go back." Her voice was quiet but firm. "No. Carter. They're going to file criminal charges. They're taking your license. Everything you worked for is disappearing, and it's my fault. It's not your fault." "Then whose fault is it?" She was getting louder now, angrier. "You made this choice. You threw everything away for me. And now you're losing your career, your reputation, possibly your freedom. For what? For someone you barely know? I know you. You knew the impossible version of me, the one who could see inside your head. But that's fading. Soon I'll just be a regular person you ruined your life for." Carter felt something snap inside him. "Don't tell me what my choices mean." His voice came out harder than intended. "Don't stand there and tell me I did this out of guilt or obligation or some misguided sense of debt. I made a choice. A conscious choice. And you don't get to diminish that. I'm trying to give you an out. I don't want an out." They were both standing now, facing each other across the small cabin. All the daba tension of the past 2 weeks finally erupting. "You're sacrificing everything for me, and I don't understand why. The connection is gone. The impossible thing that made me special is disappearing. Soon I'll just be nobody. And you'll have destroyed your entire life for nobody. You're not nobody." "Then what am I?" Elena's voice cracked. "Why are you doing this? Why won't you just go back and save yourself? Because I don't want to save myself." Carter's hands were shaking. "I spent 15 years saving myself, choosing my career over everything else, over my marriage, over friendships, over any chance at actually living, and I was miserable. I was successful and respected and completely hollow inside." He took a breath. "And then you happened, this impossible thing that forced me to actually feel something, to care about someone more than I cared about professional distance. And yes, maybe I made the choice out of guilt at first, or obligation, or because you knew my secrets and that created a bond. but it's not that anymore. What is it then? It's me choosing to be human instead of just being a doctor. It's me deciding that connection matters more than career, that you matter more than my license, even if I'm ordinary. Especially if you're ordinary. Because that means we're choosing each other. Not because you can do impossible things, just because we want to. The cabin was silent except for their breathing. Elena's face was wet with tears she hadn't felt fall. I'm terrified this won't be enough, that you'll regret it, that we'll figure out we don't actually work without the supernatural thing holding us together. I'm terrified of that too. Carter's voice was raw, honest, but I'd rather find out than go back to the life I had before. They stood there in the wreckage of their argument, both scared, both uncertain, both realizing they were terrified of the same thing, that choosing each other wouldn't be enough to survive what came next. Morning came with cold clarity. Carter woke first, watched pale light filter through the cabin windows. Elena was curled beside him, still sleeping, her breathing soft and even. He'd been awake most of the night thinking. When Elena's eyes opened an hour later, he was sitting at the table with coffee. We should go back, she sat up slowly, looked at him across the small room. I know. They made the decision together over breakfast. No more running, no more hiding. They'd return to the city and face what they'd done, but on their terms. Carter would meet with the medical board, accept whatever consequences came. But he'd tell the truth about why he'd done it, about Elena's impossible ability, about the ethics committee wanting to turn her into a research specimen, about choosing humanity over protocol. They might not believe him, probably wouldn't. But at least he'd go down telling the truth instead of hiding behind lies. Elena would undergo psychiatric evaluation, but with lawyers present, with her autonomy protected. She'd submit to reasonable testing, but not to being treated as a phenomenon rather than a person. It might not work. Carter would likely lose his license anyway. Elena might end up committed for observation. The system didn't forgive people who broke its rules, even with good reasons. But running forever wasn't living. It was just a slower way of disappearing. They packed in silence, the few belongings they'd brought. Carter looked around the cabin one last time. This place that had been their refuge, their sanctuary. The space where they'd learned each other without the supernatural connection mediating between them. Ready? Elena stood by the door, her bag in hand. As I'll ever be. The drive back took 3 hours. They didn't talk much, just sat with hands clasped across the console, fingers intertwined. Carter drove with his right hand, his left hand holding hers. Elena stared out the window, watching the landscape change from forest to farmland to suburbs to city. As they got closer, the traffic increased. The buildings grew taller. The world that had seemed so distant from the cabin pressed back in around them. Are you scared? Elena asked it quietly. Terrified. Me too. Carter squeezed her hand. But we're doing this together. That has to count for something. Does it? Her voice was small, uncertain. I don't know. But I'd rather find out than keep running. They crossed into the city limits just after noon. Carter's phone, which he'd left off, started buzzing the moment he turned it on. Messages flooding in. He ignored them all. Drove straight to St. Catherine's, parked in the visitor lot instead of his usual employee spot. That felt significant somehow. He wasn't staff anymore. Wasn't part of the institution. Was just a man who'd made a choice and was coming back to answer for it. Elena got out of the car, stood beside him in the parking lot. The hospital loomed in front of them, all glass and steel and institutional authority. Whatever happens in there. Carter turned to face her. Whatever they decide. I don't regret this. Any of it. Elena reached up and touched his face. A gentle gesture. Intimate. Neither do I. They walked toward the entrance together. Not because an impossible connection had forced them. Not because she could see inside his head or he felt obligated to protect her. But because they'd chosen each other. In the face of consequences. In the face of uncertainty. In the face of a system that would try to tear them apart. They'd chosen each other. And that, Carter thought as they pushed through the hospital doors, might be the only miracle that mattered. The lobby was familiar. The smell of antiseptic. The sound of pages overhead. The controlled chaos of a hospital in the middle of a shift change. Carter took Elena's hand one more time. Here we go. She squeezed back. Together. And they walked forward to face whatever came next. The hearing took place in a conference room on the 8th floor. Sterile, impersonal. A long table with 5 board members sitting in judgment. Carter sat alone on the opposite side. No lawyer, no representation. Just him and the truth. Dr. Helen Sharp led the proceedings. Her face was impassive as she read the charges. Falsification of medical records, patient endangerment, violation of professional ethics, abandonment of hospital duties. The list went on. Dr. Reid, do you dispute any of these charges? No. The simple answer seemed to surprise them. You admit to falsifying discharge paperwork? Yes. To removing a patient from hospital care without proper authorization? Yes. To abandoning your responsibilities and fleeing with said patient? Carter met her eyes. I helped a vulnerable person escape being turned into a research specimen against her will. If you want to call that abandonment, that's your choice. Murmurs around the table. Helen's expression hardened. Miss Reeves was scheduled for important neurological testing. Testing that could have advanced our understanding of consciousness and brain function after cardiac arrest. You prevented that research from happening. I prevented a human being from being treated like a laboratory experiment. She consented to treatment when she was admitted. She didn't consent to becoming the subject of experimental protocols designed to figure out why she could do something impossible. One of the other board members leaned forward. Dr. Marcus Webb, a cardiologist Carter had worked with years ago. Something impossible. You're referring to her claims about accessing your memories? I'm referring to the fact that she knew things about me no one could know. Specific, verifiable details from my past. Not lucky guesses, not cold reading. Actual knowledge of events from my life. The room went quiet. You're saying you believe her claims were genuine? Carter took a breath. I'm saying I verified them. She described contents of a safety deposit box I hadn't opened in 15 years. She knew details about my childhood, my mother, my personal history that I've never told anyone. Either she's the most sophisticated con artist in history, or something impossible happened when she died and came back. And you felt that justified violating every ethical principle we have? I felt that turning her into a case study while she was still traumatized justified protecting her humanity. Yes. Helen shuffled papers in front of her. The committee will deliberate. But I'll ask you one question first. If you could go back, knowing what you know now about the consequences, would you make the same choice? Carter didn't hesitate. Yes. The board members exchanged glances. Helen's expression was unreadable. We'll notify you of our decision within 48 hours. You're dismissed. Carter stood. walked out without looking back. Elena was waiting in the hallway outside. She'd been there for 2 hours while he faced the board. She stood when she saw him, searching his face. Well, suspended pending full investigation, probably permanent revocation. His voice was flat, factual. Elena's face crumpled. I'm so sorry. Don't be. Carter reached for her hand. They cleared you? She nodded. Full psychiatric evaluation. They decided I experienced a trauma-induced delusion that happened to include some accurate details, probably from overheard conversations or lucky guesses. My brain scans are normalizing. The unusual activity is fading. They're calling it a temporary post-hypoxic phenomenon. So you're free. I'm free. They stood in the hallway. Carter had lost his license, his career. 15 years of work dissolved in a 2-hour hearing. He should feel devastated, destroyed. But all he felt was peace. He'd made his choice, stood by it, told the truth even knowing they wouldn't believe him, accepted the consequences without hiding behind excuses or justifications. For the first time in his life, he'd chosen a person over protocol, humanity over institution, and he didn't regret it. Elena saw something in his expression. You're okay. It wasn't a question. I am. Carter meant it. How? Because I made a real choice, not the safe one, not the smart one, but the right one, and I can live with the consequences of that. They walked out of the hospital together, into afternoon sunlight. The city hummed around them, indifferent to their small drama. What now? Elena asked. Carter looked at her. This woman he'd chosen, this impossible ordinary person who knew him completely and stayed anyway. Now we figure out what comes next, together. 6 months later, Carter unlocked the door to an apartment that actually felt like home. It was small, third-floor walk-up in a neighborhood that real estate agents called emerging. The kitchen was cramped. The bathroom had questionable water pressure. But afternoon light came through the east-facing windows in a way that made everything feel warm. Elena was already there, working at the table they'd found at a second-hand store. Her tablet propped up, stylus moving across the screen as she refined a medical illustration. An anatomical heart rendered in precise detail for a patient education brochure. She looked up when he entered, smiled. How was the clinic? Busy. Good busy. We had a kid come in with an ear infection his mom had been treating with essential oils for 3 weeks. Got him on actual antibiotics. He'll be fine. Carter set down his bag. The free clinic in South End wasn't prestigious, wasn't cutting-edge research or complex surgeries. It was primary care for people who couldn't afford better. Ear infections and diabetes management and prenatal checkups. And Carter loved it. His medical license had been reinstated after a year of probation, community service, ethics courses, a formal reprimand that would stay on his record permanently. The medical board had made it clear he was lucky to practice at all. St. Catherine's hadn't offered him his position back, probably never would. He'd applied to the South End Clinic instead. Started 3 months ago, made a third of his previous salary. Worked longer hours, saw patients who couldn't always pay. And for the first time in 15 years, he came home feeling like he'd actually helped people, instead of just processed them efficiently. How's the illustration coming? Elena turned the tablet so he could see. A cross-section of lungs, airways branching like trees. Beautiful and precise, almost done. This is for a COPD education series, trying to show patients what's actually happening in their bodies in a way that's clear but not terrifying. She'd gone back to medical illustration after they'd settled, but now she worked directly with hospitals, creating patient materials, translating complex medical concepts into images people could understand. They'd found an apartment together 2 months after the hearing, moved in with mismatched furniture and no real plan beyond wanting to be in the same space. The extraordinary connection that had brought them together was completely gone now. Elena couldn't access his memories anymore, couldn't see inside his head. The impossible thing had faded like a dream upon waking, leaving only fragments. Sometimes she'd mention something, a flash of memory she still carried. Your mother's laugh? The way light looked in that childhood kitchen. Small pieces that remained even as the larger connection dissolved. And sometimes Carter would tell her something new, choose to share instead of having it known without permission. Tell her about his day, his fears, his hopes. Choose to be known. They cooked dinner together that evening. Pasta with vegetables. Nothing fancy. Elena chopped garlic while Carter boiled water. They moved around the small kitchen in comfortable choreography, no longer needing to discuss who did what. Over dinner, Elena told him about a patient education project for cardiac arrest survivors. Carter told her about a teenager at the clinic who reminded him of himself at that age. Angry and scared and trying to be invisible. Ordinary conversation, ordinary evening, ordinary life. After dishes, they sat on the second-hand couch. Elena's head on Carter's shoulder, his arm around her, the television playing something neither of them was really watching. "Do you ever regret it?" Elena asked quietly. No, Carter meant it. Even losing your career at St. Catherine's? Especially that. I was miserable there. I just didn't know it. He kissed the top of her head. What about you? Regret coming back from the dead tangled up with a stranger's memories? Elena laughed softly. Every day. But I'm stuck with you now. She tilted her face up to look at him. The impossible thing brought us together. But this, the ordinary, boring, everyday choosing each other, that's what keeps us here. Carter thought about that. About how the miracle hadn't been the supernatural connection. Hadn't been Elena accessing his memories or knowing his secrets. The miracle was this. Two damaged people learning to be whole together. Building something sustainable out of the wreckage of their old lives. Choosing connection over safety. Choosing each other over and over in small, ordinary ways. That's the real miracle, Carter said quietly. Elena smiled, settled back against him. Outside, the city moved through its evening rhythms. Inside, two people who'd been forced together by impossible circumstances now stayed together by choice. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. If this story reminded you that the deepest connections aren't always the ones we choose, but the ones we fight to keep, then you're exactly where you need to be. Subscribe for more stories of impossible beginnings that become inevitable endings, of two broken people who refuse to stay broken alone, of love that asks everything and somehow makes it worth giving. Because the best love stories aren't about fate bringing people together. They're about choice keeping them there, about ordinary moments mattering more than extraordinary circumstances, about building something real from something impossible. Until next time, remember that being known isn't always comfortable, but being known and chosen anyway, that's where love actually lives. That's the miracle worth protecting. That's what makes us human.